Hey everybody, this is Joseph. The particular episode that you are listening to right now, when we recorded it, it actually lasted us about an hour and just under 40 minutes. So I'm editing the heck out of it to try to get it down to a more reasonable time for Spotify, so that way you can listen to it in the car or wherever you listen to it. Hey Joseph, I got a question though. What if I want to listen to the whole episode? Hey, you know what, Mach? That's a really good question. You can listen to the whole episode if you listen to our Patreon when we do the pay-per-views, and I apologize, you're probably hearing my cat Mookie in the background. Our pay-per-views on the Patreon, those are always pretty much unedited, so those will go over an hour. A lot of our normal podcasts will actually go over an hour as well, but we edit those down to a reasonable time. So what I'm going to do from now on is, if you're subscribing to the Patreon, we're not going to charge anything extra for this. I will have an edited version that goes out free, both on Patreon, Spotify, and all of our other platforms, as well as an unedited version that will go on the Patreon only for our subscribers. So if you want to listen to us for an hour and almost 40 minutes, you can now. We'll get those starting up with this episode. We're not going to go back and figure out the old episodes. That just won't happen. But episodes going forward, if there is a longer version, we'll go ahead and release that there. That's all I really wanted to tell you guys. And now back to the episode. Say goodbye, Mook. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Monday Night Wars podcast. I'm your host, Joseph Rojas, and if you're hearing me, you know that we probably don't have Scott here for this episode, because usually he does the intros to these. That's right, Scott died. I'm just fucking around. He'll be back next week, guys. Don't worry about it. But until then, we do have a guest host today. I'm not doing this solo. This time, we brought someone new, someone grand, someone who mixes it with love and makes the world taste good. I'm talking about Wes Avendano from Flashback Wrestling. Wes, why don't you plug anything that you'd like to plug? Thank you so much for joining us, and then we'll kind of get into your story of wrestling.
Awesome. Thank you for having me on, Joseph. It is a pleasure. The Country Time Lemonade Gods answered your prayers. No Scott this week, but I'm here to pick up the slack, hopefully. Thank you for the intro, like I said. My name is Wesley Avendano. Some of you might be familiar with me from Instagram. I have a pretty popular account. Well, mildly popular. I don't want to, stroke my own ego.
I'm going to cut you off. It's got 70,000 people following it. That's pretty freaking good, man.
It's pretty good, dude. It took on a life of its own. Some of you might also recognize my name from The Sportster. I contribute a lot of articles to The Sportster. It has been a fun ride for the last, I want to say maybe like 3-4 years now with them. So that's kind of how I scratch my wrestling itch. I write articles for the Sportster, and I manage the Flashback Wrestling page. And that's, my little contribution to this awesome little community that we're all a part of. But I'm really excited to be on here, man, talking a little bit of Monday Night Wars with you. I've been looking forward to it, and, should be a good time.
Why don't you tell us, how did wrestling start for you? Like, how did you even get into it?
All right, dude. So it's funny because I actually wrote an article about like my wrestling journey, my odyssey or whatever, right? I'm a writer, so I think I'm poetic. My first exposure, my first memory to wrestling is WrestleMania 9. It's not live. It is a videotape, a VHS.
Nice.
You kids, back in the day, we had VHSs. And one day, my cousin, who was a girl. I mean, maybe you wouldn't expect that. You'd expect a guy to have wrestling tapes. My girl cousin popped in a VHS of WrestleMania 9. It caught my attention. I saw it over and over and over, and it left an impression on me. At the time, I must have been like 4 or 5 years old, so I couldn't decide for myself at that time really yet, like what to watch on TV. There was no on demand. This is something I tell my kids all the time, like, hey man, there was no on demand back in the day. You had to know what time it was on, what channel it was on, and if you didn't, you just weren't, you weren't there. So I got exposed to WrestleMania 9, loved it. Fell in love with Bret Hart, fell in love with Hulk Hogan, just the whole presentation, the pageantry. Didn't really circle back again full time until WrestleMania 13. Shortly before WrestleMania 13, I start, like seeing it on my TV. It starts becoming more relevant in my life. And then WrestleMania 13 happens, and it's another one of those, serendipitous moments where we're at a party and somebody turns on the television. And back in the 90s, we used to have these illegal black boxes that you could you could pirate that you could pirate pay-per-view on. We may or may not have had one of those. WrestleMania 13's on. And so I'm watching it, and immediately all those feelings of like, oh, wrestling's cool and this and that, they come flooding back. And I'm sitting there, I'm watching it, and I'm watching it, and I'm in it, right? Like I'm like, okay, this is cool. I could see myself getting into it again, and blah blah blah. And then boom, the guy that pulled me into it in the first place comes out, and it's Brett. And now they're telling this interesting story about, oh well, Brett's like teetering to maybe becoming a bad guy now.
Right.
And then the match happens with Stone Cold, and I fall in love immediately back, and then from then on, it was just like a constant. I went out of my way. I made sure that I would find it and I would watch it. And it's been an interesting journey since then, man. It has been a big part of my life in many different ways.
Interesting you mentioned WrestleMania 13 because obviously that's like a great WrestleMania for a jumping off point. They're starting to figure out the Stone Cold character. Bret Hart's getting a lot better. Shawn Michaels is getting a lot better. But at the time, WCW's killing it. So did you ever watch WCW at this point, or were you just WWF?
So at that exact moment, I was just WWF, but it didn't take me long. Like, my memories kind of, from being a kid, especially, they run back. So this was 1997. So I was 7.5 years old when WrestleMania 13 happens. And I remember being in the specific apartment that we lived in, right? And I can't remember exactly what the timeline was, but while we lived in that same apartment, and we used to kind of jump apartments, like every year or so. So my memories from that apartment only cover a certain time span. And I remember in that apartment one day channel surfing, like we used to call it back in the day,
Yeah.
and I saw Ultimo Dragon against somebody. I can't remember who, dude, but I remember Ultimo Dragon because it immediately hooked me.
Yeah, he's got a
And
great look, right? As a kid, that's the
exactly.
kind of look that you love. Yeah.
Exactly. So I'm like, who's this? What's this? And I start watching, and then all of a sudden pieces start coming together. There was wrestling fans in my family before me.
Right.
I've never actually understood like where that seed was planted, but I do remember as a kid having like action figures of Ultimate Warrior, Sting, like hand-me-downs too, not
Yeah.
brand new stuff. So they had to have come from somewhere, right? I remember I was watching WCW, and then all of a sudden I started recognizing stuff that I had seen in the past. For example, the Steiners were in WWE at WrestleMania 9,
Right.
but they weren't in WWE in 1997. But eventually they show up in WCW, and obviously I see Hogan, I see Savage, and all of a sudden, a whole nother world opened up to me. And then I jump right in, dude. And this is 97 around WrestleMania, full blown into the NWO Sting storyline. That's really where my fandom just, takes off to the next level at the Sportster. I've kind of been labeled the WCW guy.
It
For
feels like
whatever reason.
that's not really true though. I mean, you really were the WWF guy.
No, definitely. That's
Yeah.
why I think it's super interesting and super funny, because that's like what one of my guys from the Sportster, his name is Tavon. He reaches out to me all the time. One of the first few times he reached out to me, it was, we all share articles. Sometimes I have an article I can't finish, or vice versa, and we like to hand them off. So he reaches out to me and he goes, "Hey man, you're the WCW guy, right? Do you want these articles?" And it was like a collection of like 4 or 5 WCW specific articles. And I go, "Yeah, man, I guess I'm the WCW guy, man. Sure." And this was around the time where I had been rewatching all the old Nitros.
Gotcha.
So I kind of was the WCW guy, but it was not by design. That was never my intention to be the WCW guy. And funny enough, on Flashback Wrestling on Instagram, I have a day that I dedicate strictly to Sting. It's on Saturdays. It's called Stinger Saturday, and it's the only theme day that I do still. And so the misconception from a lot of my followers is that I'm a Sting mark, that he's my favorite wrestler.
Yeah.
But I'd say Sting snuck into like my borderline top 5 in the last 6 or 7 years that I've been doing Instagram, mainly because I've become even more familiar with him, like
Right.
older stuff that I hadn't watched. Really, I'm a WWE loyalist and diehard. I've been labeled the WCW guy at the Sportster, and I'm looked at as like a massive Sting fan on Instagram. So I think that's funny.
It's kind of interesting you mentioned this thing with Sting, because I feel pretty similarly to that. I always loved Sting as a kid, right? Because he's just so cool looking, When I was a kid, was Crow Sting and all that, and I always appreciated him. I was just the other day for fun. I don't remember why this happened. There was some sort of topical thing where I was like, I wonder who would be my top 10 wrestlers of all time. And I had done this like 10, 15 years ago, and it was very. I feel like fans go through different waves, and one of the waves that we all kind of go through is like, we only like technical wrestlers for a while, and we
Yes.
kind of go like that, these are the real wrestlers because they can go 60 minutes, they can blah blah blah. And I think if you're I don't want to say smart because that's not fair, but I think if you understand wrestling as a whole, you realize that technical wrestlers are phenomenal. I love Dean Malenko. There is always the drawback of he's not a great character. I'm not saying it to hurt him or anything. If you want to talk about people who are draws and why they're draws, you kind of have to have a little bit of everything. Storytelling has really become important to me. And so as I've watched Sting, not only through this podcast, but I kind of went back and started doing my own stuff with that, Sting has been elevating so much more because he's so underrated. Like, people don't give him the credit because once he hit Crow, he kind of just stayed there for a long time. And I just feel like people have kind of lost sight of how great this guy was. There's a reason why he has so much reverence. And I think the more you watch his stuff, the more you're like, Jesus Christ, this guy's really, really good. Anyways.
No, I definitely agree. And Sting was one of those guys for me where like he always had a special place in my heart or in my fandom, right? Because of the NWO angle. I almost exclusively thought of Sting in that light. You know what I'm saying? Like, so I jump into the WCW side full time in '97, and at that point he's already Crow. If you get introduced to the Crow Sting version initially, it's really hard to go back and look at the other version, the Surfer Sting version. In hindsight, when you go and you look at it, that Surfer Sting character is so special because he's everything that wrestling pundits, Vince McMahon, promoters in general, he's everything that they wish the Ultimate Warrior could have been. Like
100%, yeah.
Sting is upside down dimension Ultimate Warrior. So much similarities, man. Like so many similarities. The look, the face paint, the bodybuilder physique. I mean, obviously Sting shrunk down a lot throughout the years, but at the beginning, they were almost carbon copies of each other, minus, the long hair. And so I always think that Sting doesn't get as much credit. Sting's Crow persona was so influential and so good that it almost blurred out the Surfer Sting. And that's something, like I said, over the last few years, I've grown to appreciate a lot more because I've seeked out a lot more Surfer Sting material because eventually I ran out of like Crow Sting stuff. And so you got to do deep dives and you got to go in and investigate and stuff. And I definitely would say like Sting is snuck into my top 5, top 6. To touch on the point that you made, dude, I just had that conversation a couple of weeks ago with one of my cousins. He came down to visit. We've always been big wrestling fans. And it's an argument I'm sure you've heard before. It is so hard to sit here and rank like a top 5, a top 10.
It's
or
very
anything.
hard, yeah.
Because I think it's all circumstantial. Well, not even circumstantial. It just depends on preference. What youth value isn't necessarily what we all value and vice versa, right? So like personally, I love technical wrestlers. Bret Hart is my favorite wrestler. But I also understand that in the grand scheme of things, Bret isn't like one of the most well-rounded performers ever.
Right.
Because he was a great technical wrestler, but the character just wasn't there as much. Although I feel like his 1997 run is grossly underrated. It gets overshadowed by Montreal, obviously.
Yeah.
But that 97 run was special. And it proved that he did have a lot more range than he was showing maybe. Me personally, I think the GOAT, I think it's Savage. I think Savage is the most.
That's an interesting one. I wasn't expecting that. I don't disagree, by the way, because he is in my top 5 for sure. To be clear to the audience, what we're talking about is like top 10 favorites. We're not talking about top 10 really greatest, except for when we just said GOAT. That's kind of the exception to this.
Yes, exactly.
I think you can make an excellent case for Savage because when you look at his wrestling, what we're talking about right now in the Monday Night Wars, he's starting to slow way down, but he's still excellent in the ring. In a few years, injuries will really get to him, but presentation, his in-ring ability, Scott makes fun of me for it all the time on the podcast, where he'll compare a match that's fun to WrestleMania 3, Ricky the Dragon Steamboat versus Macho Man Randy Savage, because he knows that I hold that match in such high esteem. So he'll always tongue-in-cheek reference that. But I did cut you off. I'm sorry. You were talking about Savage.
No, I agree with you, dude. The point that I'm getting to is that, yeah, Savage was so well-rounded promo-wise. Go look at any Savage promo, dude. And like, there's an intensity there that sometimes, like this specific episode that we're going to talk about,
oh yeah,
he like towards the tail end of that promo that he cuts, he starts to wander a little bit, sure. But it never gets egregious like the Ultimate Warrior, and that intensity is just so, it's so good. And in ring, really the original high flyer as far as like main eventers and guys that were of that status. In the 80s, you didn't really see guys taken to the air like that. You see a guy like Snuka, but I want to quantify that by saying Snuka never reached Savage's level. You see guys like Muta, and again, Muta's great, but on a global stage, he never reached Savage's level.
Right.
I just think Savage is the definition of consistency and just well-rounded overall, man. He dominated the mid card, he dominated the main event. I won't say great announcer, but he was a great personality. You could sit here and compare him to Bobby Heenan or Jesse Ventura, and he's not going to hold a candle to them.
Right.
But you know what? He was a notch above. He was a notch above Piper. He was a notch above DiBiase, Mr. Perfect, and a lot of the other guys that got thrown into the booth that we thought could do a good job. Savage, I would say, was the best ones out of those guys going into WCW, man, and thinking that he's got nothing left in the tank, and then he creates Diamond Dallas Page out of thin air.
Right.
He pulls out, he creates a superstar, and he's just, to me, he's the epitome of and Flair's a close second for me personally.
We're running a little long on this now, guys. You know that if we have a guest host, we're going to run long because we want to talk about, how they got into things and all that stuff. But we do actually have to get to the show. So we're going to go ahead and do that right now. This is a great show for you to be a guest host on for infamous reasons, which we'll get to at the tail end of this. But before we get into that, we have to get into Monday Night Nitro. It is September 23rd, 1996. And we're coming to you live from the Benjamin Jefferson Civic Center in Birmingham, Alabama. In our first segment, we have the announcement that all of the top guys in WCW are in Japan, which Tony Schiavone makes sure to remind us. The NWO will have easy access to Randy Savage. The NWO ran an ad in USA Today that had the quote, "While the WCW is away, the NWO will play." We get a recap of Macho Man versus the Giant at Fall Brawl, but if you want to hear about that, you'll have to subscribe to our Patreon, $2 a month. Earlier today, the WCW fans are tearing up NWO propaganda. Our first match is the Dungeon of Doom. This particular variation is Taskmaster, Conan, and Jimmy Hart versus Juventud Guerrera and Brad Armstrong. Juvi hits a ton of flippy shit. Conan hits a powerbomb, then Sullivan hits a stomp for a quick 1-2-3. However, apparently Sullivan is upset that he got tagged in. He didn't want to be, so Sullivan and Bubba attack Conan. This is an initiation, apparently, just like the Mexican youth gangs of East Los Angeles, according to Mike Tenay.
Dude, Mike Tenay has one of the most underrated gem lines during that attack. It stood out so much that I literally had to make a note on it. He goes, "That's the way Conan grew up in the barrio." And that made me chuckle so hard. It was the fun, I audibly, I was sitting there watching it and I go, because it was that funny. But I thought that was great, man. I thought that was funny. That was a lot more entertaining than I expected it to be. I'm a snob in certain stuff, and I hate WWE's cartoonish era.
Yeah.
So naturally, the Dungeon of Doom isn't something that I was super into. But in hindsight, it's a fun time, man. It's a fun little gimmick. I don't know what Conan is doing in Dungeon of Doom or even being associated with him. I never thought that was a good association. And
no, it's wild. Yeah.
I think it's cool that Conan came down with the AAA, the Triple A heavyweight championship, and they just referred to it as the Mexican heavyweight championship. Obviously, I don't want to give away too much from your Fall Brawl episode, but I thought it was funny that at Fall Brawl he defends that title against Juvi, but doesn't come out with it. The title's nowhere to be seen. I thought that was super funny. But this was enjoyable. I actually thought it was pretty cool. For an opening match, Nitro's always had the reputation of having good opening matches. I'm a Juvi guy. He's my second favorite cruiserweight. I never considered Benoit or Guerrero true cruiserweights. I always thought they were tweeners.
Gotcha.
They were US champions. They moved up the card a little bit. Benoit, I don't think is ever even a cruiserweight champion. So right. Benoit definitely I never considered a cruiserweight. And Eddie I always considered to be a cruiserweight plus, right? He was always more than a cruiserweight, even in WCW. So for me it was always Ray, and then right after Ray, I always liked Juvi, man. I love the hair, I love the look, the masks. To me, I was a big Juvi guy. Honestly, when they took the mask off and then he started talking and stuff, that's kind of when he started to lose me. As much as I hate to admit it, I really just like the aura of the masked wrestler. Something interesting that immediately when I saw that Brad Armstrong was teamed with Juvi, something that jumped to mind was wow, in 3 years, these guys are going to be on opposite sides of the fence. Juvi with the Filthy Animals, and Brad Armstrong, BA, with the No Limit Soldiers.
Brad Armstrong is such an interesting man to me. From a pure wrestling standpoint, he is fantastic. He's so good in the ring. He's got the perfect look. And God, he is such a boring character. He is just vanilla.
So I always say about Brad Armstrong and one of his brothers.
Yep. I know where you're going with this.
Yeah, it's that you can only be born with one of these skills, it's kind of been proven that if you're entertaining, at least,
Yeah.
you can get away with not being the greatest wrestler. The Road Dogg is probably not even in the top 50 of like great technical wrestlers, or even top
Right.
100 of great technical wrestlers. But I bet you he's in somewhere close to that in entertaining and, sports entertainers and stuff like that. And I think even Road Dogg came out like a year or two ago and said that he was a better sports entertainer than Bret Hart. And for a Bret Hart fan, immediately
Yeah.
I'd scoffed at that, but then I thought about it and I'm like, well, you know what? I mean, I don't personally think so, but I could see where you would think that, because he was such an entertaining character and performer, and Brad just, I don't know if he that gene just didn't make it into his bloodline.
I,
I guess I don't know.
I had a note here that was if you took Brad Armstrong's wrestling ability and his physique and you added it to Road Dogg's mouth and entertainment factor, you'd have the greatest wrestler of all time.
This is true, dude. That's honestly that's honestly the best definition or the best summary of what that situation is like. Because really, I mean, Bullet Bob Armstrong, they come from a wrestling dynasty. Like, it's in their blood. It's just, I always thought it was pretty crazy that, yeah, Brad was like by far the superior athletic talent and like in-ring talent, but then Road Dogg was just, so much better on the mic. It's crazy.
All right, moving on, we have our next segment where we see footage from last week where the NWO said that they would be here tonight. Mike Tenay is ready to interview Macho Man Randy Savage, and he tells him that the NWO have publicly targeted him and that they are here tonight, at which point Mach says, "They are. Am I a marked man? Is that what you're thinking? Well, let me tell you something, Hollywood Hulk Hogan. Whatever it takes, if you're gonna cheap shot me every night and every day, before we get to Halloween Havoc, that's not gonna change anything, because I'm gonna take it down, because I'm the last hope for the WCW. Otherwise, the entire wrestling world is gonna be turned upside down. You're threatening to make that happen! And another thing, let's get the record straight right now. The whole WCW, the majority of them were booked in Japan. And I was booked in Japan too, but I took myself out of there." He continues to say,
By the way, your Savage is incredible. I've always thought that, and I appreciate, as somebody who can do a little Savage himself once in a while, I gotta tip my hat and give credit where it's due. The cream of the crop. Yeah, dig it.
So he goes, not because I got an unbelievable stroke or anything. I just felt I needed to be at Nitro because it's not cut in stone. Whether you're going to beat me up or I'm going to beat up the whole NWO tonight. And about Elizabeth, let me tell you something. Not this lifetime, not the next lifetime. Maybe the only thing we got in common is about 100,000 lifetimes away from now. We might be the same goldfish swimming in the same water. Now, nothing makes sense, but I'm going to tell you something that does. Halloween Havoc is very scary, and I'm not scared. And Hollywood Hulk Hogan, I take the responsibility to wipe you out. Understand that? Wes, what are your thoughts on this promo from Mach?
It was fun, dude. Like I referenced earlier, he wandered just a smidge at the end, and the cut in stone line. I used to. Bobby Heenan is one of the guys that always used to do that too, and so it always made me curious, right? Because Bobby Heenan would constantly like mispronounce stuff, get saying wrongs and stuff like that. Come to find out later that Heenan used to do that on purpose. Like that was all calculated, and he put that much thought into what he was going to say and do. Knowing Savage and knowing how much preparation he put into almost everything he did, hearing that specific line sometimes makes me wonder, was that a slip of the tongue or was that planned just to kind of get across the fact that, right now he's really heated and stuff? Because Macho Man was brilliant. There's going to be very few Macho Man promos that I'll ever
not like
watch and then just be like, oh, that was a miss for me. It's, to me, the guy crushes just about every promo.
He called himself at Fall Brawl, and I'm giving this away for free, folks, necessary evil for WCW. And I thought I really wish they would keep going with that. Like, that could have been his new gimmick for a little while, but whatever. You made a point if he kind of wanders the very end there. I cleaned up what he said in my rendition of it because he does fumble quite a few times. He's very clearly sick when he does this promo, by the way. You can hear it in his voice. He's very sick. He's kind of forcing himself through it. Up next, we have Mike Enos versus Chris Jericho. Mike Enos takes a cheap shot to Jericho early, and Jericho starts laying into him. Jericho counters a power slam into a pin for the win. Wes, what did you think about this one?
So immediately upon watching Mike Enos walk out there, I noticed the fact that Gary Pinzer calls him mean Mike Enos. And immediately then I start looking at it and I'm like, I wonder if that has anything whatsoever to do with Undertaker's old persona in WCW, Mean Mark Callis,
Right.
because there was almost then like it all came flooding back. He was kind of wearing the same entrance gear, the chaps and the vest, the leather, as Mean Mark Callis used to wear when he was one of the skyscrapers, and then when he had that solo run. That, for whatever reason, that connection was there for me. The match itself was okay. I mean, I didn't mind it. It was awesome to see, a young Jericho before he was a learning tree. He was just, a knowledge sapling. And
By
he's
the way,
right.
I got to apologize. I just registered what your fucking joke was, and I just
That was good,
ignored
right?
it.
But yeah, no, man. I mean, Jericho has made reference to it before that he was just, kind of like a smiling buffoon in WCW, and that definitely this is the version that we get in this match. I think the finish could have been a little cleaner. I don't hold it against them too much because Enos is a really big guy, and Jericho was a bit smaller, and Jericho's a lot smoother in his transitions, and so like the roll up could have been a little bit like the counter to the power slam could have been a little cleaner. But that's just me nitpicking, dude. I do have to point out really quickly that somebody backstage, this is pretty common theme throughout Nitro, somebody backstage, some producer or agent wasn't paying attention, because how do you get 2 avalanche power bombs back-to-back matches? Because
Yeah.
Conan hits one on Hoovy to end the match. Enos hits one on Jericho, right? Jericho kicks out. And logically, Enos is bigger than Conan, and Jericho and Hoovy are roughly the same size. Maybe Hoovy's a couple of inches smaller. So it just didn't make sense to me why you would book 2, especially in the 90s where like moves were so protected. And if you finish a man with one move and then the very next match somebody comes out and kicks out of that move, you're almost burying the move.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? So I just thought that was weird. But again, that's just me. I'm a snob.
Up next, though, we have Goldberg Pat Tanaka.
Oh my God, that's the first thing oh my God, that is the first, because I was like 96. I heard the music and I'm like 90. No, this is wrong. Like, what?
So
He's here?
So to explain that for the listeners, Goldberg has not debuted yet. And Pat Tanaka has Goldberg's original music because most WCW entrance music was actually just TNT stock music that they had because they were paying so much for wrestlers. They didn't want to pay people for music. It was a way they could, cut costs. Even the NWO theme, which is iconic to this day, it was just stock music. All they did was they recorded someone saying New World Order a few times, and that was it. That being said, we did most recently see Tanaka as the legendary Mexican wrestler that wasn't at all made up by the WCW, El Gato. He's going up against, I gotta do this for Scott, Blood Runs Cold. It's Glacier. The crowd gives Glacier a little bit more love than he got last week, but not a lot. Glacier's entrance makes me feel like I'm playing laser tag. Glacier wins quickly with a black mass before it was called the Black Mass.
Oh my God, that's what I wrote in my notes. That's literally what I have in my notes. Where, like, he wins with a black mass before, and it was actually really clean,
Yeah, it was
dude.
clean,
Like
yeah.
it was a good kick.
Then he does a bunch of martial arts poses in the laser tag arena. And that's pretty much it. It's a very quick match. I think this is maybe like a minute 30. I didn't take down all the time. Scott does that every time. I could not be bothered to do that. So sorry, listener, if you're really hoping for those times. But Glacier wins. How'd you feel about this one, Wes?
My main takeaway, and I wrote it in my notes. I don't know how big of a Dragon Ball Z fan you are, or
Love Dragon Ball Z. Yeah.
Okay, Glacier is straight out of the Ginyu Force. He would have fit right in with them because that half of that match is just him posing. Like him and Six would have just. I can imagine them in the backstage in WCW. Like in the locker room area, just both of them, just because Six at this time is like super martial arts guy, and he's always posing and doing his stuff too. And I can just imagine them in the back. Oh, what do you think of this pose, bro? Oh, what do you think of this pose? Like, cause it was funny, dude. Like I said, the match itself wasn't too bad. Like in hindsight, I see why the Glacier character failed, but at the same time, like I think maybe 2 years earlier, it would have gone over pretty big, and maybe it would have worked. I think with failed gimmicks in wrestling, a lot of times it's the timing, man. It really is like something. You debut something at one point and it doesn't work for whatever reason, but had you debuted it a year later or 5 years later, or in some cases 10 years earlier, it makes all the difference. You know what I'm saying? And I think the Glacier character is a great example of that. I think had Glacier come out like in 94, I think he would have been a bigger star. I won't say huge star, but I think he would have been a bigger star for the company.
As far as the timing goes, there's actually a really good comparison that me and Scott, I don't know if we talked about on this podcast, we've definitely talked about it, just together, which is that PG-13, which will soon debut in WWF. And I think they've had one match so far, but they'll be in the Nation and all that stuff. And they're horrible for what they're cast in. However, if you really look at their gimmick, they're essentially the New Age Outlaws just 2 years ahead. And it's really funny when you look at that and you go, man, if they had just waited like a year and then let them do their own thing, this would have worked perfectly because it was the right time. But 97, when WWF's failing and there's still a lot of cartooniness going on, just wasn't the right time for that.
No, it's actually a great example because, yeah, that's kind of what it is, man. It's like a snake shedding its old skin, dude. A couple times during the show where stuff just feels out of place. You're like, am I in late 90s here or am I in the early 90s here? Because you're kind of meshing two generations. And I think 96 WCW is the greatest example of that.
Moving on, we have Matt Gaffari, 1996 silver medalist for Greco-Roman wrestling, is here in the crowd because apparently Kurt Angle wasn't available, I assume. Next, we have a WCW tag team title match. It's Public Enemy versus Harlem Heat. Now, if you listen to the show, you know I inherently do not like Public Enemy, so I'll keep this as civil as possible. During the match, the NWO show up in their limo and they're ready to enter the building. We get a weird ending of the match where a roll-up can seemingly go either way between, I think it's Booker T and Rocco Rock. But Nick Patrick ends up giving the win to Public Enemy, and they are the new WCW Tag Team Champions, obviously to the dismay of Harlem Heat, and they get super upset. And that closes out this match. Wes, what'd you think about this one?
I thought the match was not bad. I thought that Public Enemy, so I have written in my notes here, looks like Phil. So Johnny Grunge just so happens to look like one of the HVAC guys that I work with here at my job. His name's Phil, so for whatever reason, looks just like him. I'm almost tempted to text my guy and ask him, like, "Hey man, did you what you do in your younger years? Because because you look like Johnny Grunge." The match itself was actually pretty fun. The roll up at the end was actually, so here's the funny part. I thought their roll up was better executed than the Jericho Enos roll up. Because I went back and watched it once I realized that was the finish. I went back and rewatched the setup, rewatched the shoulders, and it was a legitimate reversal of the small package or whatever, and Public Enemy wins. It was a little long, I will say that. It was just like a smidge long. I caught myself a couple of times thinking wow, they're really giving Public Enemy this much time, huh? I will say two things. There's a couple spots in the match where there seemed to be some confusion. Harlem Heat would hit a move and then wait extremely long to go for the pin and then go for the pin. And it was just a little weird, a little off. I will say though, there was a spot in the match where Stevie Irish whips, I believe it's Rocco Rock into the ropes, and then Booker comes running from behind Stevie and hits a Harlem sidekick. Maybe it's just me. I think that they could have had a tandem finisher with Stevie just Irish whipping the guy and Booker coming out of nowhere with a Harlem sidekick. I think that might have been a missed opportunity because it was sick. I remember it was so perfectly hit and executed, and it looked devastating that I wrote into my notes wow, that would have made a great tandem finish for them.
Yeah, I agree. I think that there's a lot of untapped potential with them, and you'll see things I don't think it happened in this match, but you'll see Booker T do the scissors kick and you're like, oh my god, how have you not figured out that's it?
Exactly.
You know what I mean? So there's just little things like that that they do quite a bit. But we're gonna have to move on to hour number 2, where Eric Bischoff, Mike Tenay, and Bobby the Brain Heenan are on commentary. Bischoff says that NWO has told him that they have a surprise later on in the night. It's Greg the Hammer Valentine taking on Macho Man Randy Savage in our first match of hour 2. Super Callow apparently dislocated his elbow in a dark match, according to Eric Bischoff, as this match spills to the outside of the ring. Mach is seemingly tired of this match, so he grabs a chair and jumps off the top rope and hits Valentine with it for the DQ finish. Directly after this, the NWO swarm him. Scott Hall hits the outsider's edge as Liz is at the entrance ramp scared and she runs away. Kevin Nash hits a jackknife, then the Giant comes in with a mic, wearing a dress shirt, pants, and vest, which is just very odd to look at on the Giant, and introduces Hollywood Hulk Hogan. Hogan punches a limp Savage and hits the atomic leg drop, then a second one. Nash whips him with a Slim Jim, which I actually chuckled about. Hogan refers to NWO fans as NWOites for the very first time and says even though he is used to Hollywood lights, the lights shining off Mach's bald head are just too bright. So he decides to spray paint Mach's head, which is very ironic, but also I think Hogan knows. The Outsiders charge commentary and manhandle Bischoff as Bobby runs away. Hall and Nash grab headsets and introduce Ted DiBiase's new head of security, Vincent, who was formerly Virgil in the WWF. The NWO antagonize Bischoff as Mach is battered and bruised and helped to the back. Luckily, Mach is to WCW what Tua Tagovailoa is to the Miami Dolphins, so he'll be back. Wes, what'd you think about this whole match?
Okay, so I actually
It's a lot. There's a lot in this, yeah.
What's the Hammer? And I like Greg Valentine, but what's the Hammer doing in WCW in any major promotion in 1996? Because I think it was like a month or two earlier, he actually challenges the Giant for the world title.
Yeah.
And I remember thinking then, and this is just me off the top of my head remembering. I haven't hadn't rewatched that era in a while, but that stuck with me even back then when I was rewatching it. It was like, what the hell is Valentine doing challenging for the world title? Like, obviously we know he's not going to win it, but the fact that in kayfabe this guy even gets a shot was crazy to me. And again, all due respect to the Hammer, definitely a legend, but just in 1996, definitely felt out of place. The main takeaway I got from this was Savage was so over with the WCW audience in 96.
Oh, yeah.
Like so over. I hate that they had Savage join the NWO. I really do. I understand.
I agree.
I understand for the purpose of making Sting your last hope and your ultimate hero and this and that. It makes sense. But man, I've said it very, very often throughout the years. They made a mistake. They should have let Savage at least be, his number two, his backup. Have Savage be outside of the NWO bubble, because I think he gets lost in the shuffle after that. Obviously, he manages to break out and do his own thing with DDP after a while, but for a while there, once he joins the NWO, he does kind of just become a background member, which is sad. It really is. I liked Hogan super healing out and just spray painting Macho Man's bald spot. That was great. That was awesome. It's hard to sit here and like explain to anybody who didn't live through Hogan being a heel how monumental that was and how out of left field that was. Because today, like, who's the biggest babyface in wrestling today? Well, we'd say probably Cody, right? But we've seen Cody be a heel. That's nothing new. I guess we could say John Cena, but at this point, it almost feels like if John Cena were to go heel now, it would be like, oh, well, just because I need to cross this off my list, I've never done it.
Yeah, it's too late, yeah.
Exactly. This was legitimately Hogan in the middle of his career. Obviously we didn't know that back then. Back then, people might have thought he was towards the tail end of it, but he was really in the middle of his career, in the prime of his career, you could even say, going heel and doing something that was, probably not advised to him by a lot of people. And he plays it so great, man. Like, it gets cheesy and it gets a little corny here and there, but I'd like to think that that's by design. I think Hogan is just one of those characters that once he found his heel edge, he wasn't afraid to be, too heelish or too cheesy, because being cheesy and being corny almost kind of like fit in with what he was doing anyways. It antagonized people. So, I mean, I love it, dude. I like this segment. I thought it made the NWO look like, total thugs and menaces. And it helped, endear Savage even more to the WCW audience and make you want to see him win.
I will run through a few things real quickly on that. I agree on the Savage thing. I think, so you mentioned the whole Sting stuff. There's obviously ramifications if you don't turn Savage heel. There's also huge ramifications for DDP's career if you don't turn Savage heel. So there's definitely some huge bonuses that came out of it. That being said, from a pure Savage character, it makes no sense why he'd turn heel. Like, he is the guy who's been defending WCW this whole time, and only him pretty much. So it makes no sense from a storyline standpoint. It'll get better down the road, but I agree with you. The other thing is, Scott and I have been talking about this for a few weeks on the show, where we've kind of, hindsight being 2020, we're able to see cracks in the NWO. Things where it's like, oh, that was a mistake. They don't know it yet. And the NWO is so hot that it's not going to affect them for a long time. But we have a massive one here, which is that Vincent should have been nowhere near the NWO. This whole Virgil becoming Vincent thing, makes no sense. It adds nothing to them. It is an absolute, hey, remember that guy? Do you remember him? He used to be over there doing that, and now he's here. That's kind of it. He doesn't add anything. And this is like where it starts to become like, oh, who's a friend of ours? Oh, he's in.
I tend to agree with you. I think that Vincent is the first, like, questionable one. You know what? I'm actually scratch that. To me personally, I think the Giant's the first questionable addition. I never thought the
I
Giant
agree.
should have been put in there. I think to keep the premise, Bischoff likes to, I won't say backtrack now, but he likes to, and I love Bischoff.
Yeah.
But he likes to revise history now a little bit. He likes to say, "Oh, well, the angle was inspired by Japan and an angle that I saw in Japan." And while that might be true, he knew what he was doing. He knew what the implications were. The implications were that WWF was invading WCW.
Right.
And that's what this all was about. And to get that point over across better, I think it would have made sense to keep the Giant out of the NWO and just leave it as former WWE guys, right? Keep it Hogan, Hall, Nash, Six, DiBiase.
Scott will love you because he's been saying for weeks that it should only be ex-WWF guys, and that's it. And I do agree. It makes a lot of sense. There are people later on that kind of make sense. But even, if you look at someone like Scott Steiner, he's still technically an ex-WWF guy. Really quick, wrap this up. I think that core of obviously Hall, Nash, Hogan, Six, and DiBiase, I think that should have been your first year, is just those 5. Bischoff
Exactly.
should never have joined, personally.
Yeah, dude, I'm right there with you. Again, and this is from someone, I love Bischoff, dude.
Agreed, yeah.
I listen to 83 Weeks. I think Bischoff doesn't get enough credit for being the only person in wrestling history to ever go toe to toe with Vince McMahon. I strongly believe that. But yeah, no, that was a miscalculation on his part. I think Bischoff saw the train leaving and said, "Oh, it's not leaving without me. I'm gonna get on that train." I agree with Scott. It should have been ex WWE guys exclusively for the first year.
Moving on, we have another NWO segment. It's a paid promotion brought to you by the NWO. It's for their shirt again, but this one's got Giant in it as well. But we also get a classic Kevin Nash, buy this shirt. We come back from commercial and the NWO is still on commentary, minus Hogan, who they suggest they can take over NASCAR, which seems out of pocket when all of a sudden a New World Order NASCAR car comes out. And they announce Kyle Petty will be their racer. Giant is down at the ring to provide the announcements. It's Jim Powers with Teddy Long versus VK Wall Street, who they're now calling M Wall Street. Nash says they're going to get closer and take a look at this matchup. And Ted DiBiase takes over on commentary with Bischoff, which honestly, I think Ted DiBiase is pretty decent at that, so that's fine. The Outsiders absolutely destroy Jim Powers, and VK or M Wall Street, whatever they're calling him, just lets them. He just kind of leaves. Referee Randy Anderson leaves, saying he wants no part of this and emphasizes this by removing his clip-on tie, which made me laugh hysterically. Nick Patrick takes over, and Giant toys with Jim Powers before hitting a chokeslam. Hogan is actually in the back, and he's running around spray painting walls, and he knocks on the Nasty Boys dressing room and tells them he wants to talk business with them. The Nasty Boys accept the invitation to Hogan's hotel room, where I assume someone's wife is ready to bang Hogan while he shouts the N-word, allegedly. Wes, what are your thoughts on this segment?
First of all, I didn't say this in the last segment, but man, did the Giant just stop at the world's biggest men's warehouse or what? Like,
yeah.
Because Jesus, man, like that was such a horrible look for him back then. Like, I hope he didn't dress like that in real life, because, man, it just wasn't a man that big should not be trying to, blend in. But besides that, I like that the NWO invasion of Nitro. I thought it was cool. Like you said, I thought it dragged on in a couple of spots. I thought Hogan just walking around backstage, spray painting NWO on the walls and stuff. I thought that was pretty funny. I thought that was good. The recurring theme for me during this show is, in hindsight, I know what the reasoning is. A lot of their stars were in Japan.
Right.
There's a lot of C-level talent, dude, on this card. Like a lot of C-level talent, and Jim Powers is is one of them, unfortunately. I felt like there was a couple of spots it could have gone a little better, maybe with a bigger name star in the ring at the time. I enjoy Kenny Powers though, right? For all my Eastbound and Down fans, Nick Patrick. But no, man, I always dug him as the heel referee. I think that's something that it's been long enough to where maybe we can revisit it now in modern day wrestling and maybe get a nice angle out of it. Because I always dug that he was the heel referee that always sided with the NWO.
Mhm.
And I also kind of thought it was a missed opportunity when at Starrcade 97 he kind of does a face turn and you know, he kind of like has a coming to God, you know, a meeting with God moment or
Yeah.
whatever, and ends up being turning face. I thought it was a good segment, but the show starts to drag on a little bit for me here because it's almost like, okay, we get it. You've invaded the show. You're taking over the show. But what's going to happen next?
Right, right. So speaking of next, we have Hacksaw Jim Duggan, who's Scott's boy. So if you're going to say anything negative, be very careful.
No, no, no. I like Hacksaw.
Versus Ron Studd, formerly the Yeti. Hogan intercepts Studd to talk with him, and he says something like, "Oh, that's our boy over there," blah, blah. And then he and Nash attack the former Yeti. Instead, Six is ready to face Hacksaw, and Hacksaw starts swinging his 2x4 wildly. Hogan takes over on commentary, and a distracted Hacksaw gets attacked by Six. Hacksaw begins to wallop Six when Giant pulls Hacksaw out of the ring, which Nick Patrick conveniently doesn't see, and he hits him with a chokeslam. Giant rolls him back in. Six gets his first Nitro victory. I love this. I'm going to go ahead and say I gave this an A, but Wes, what do you think?
Okay, so this was probably my favorite throwaway match or squash match during the second hour. Duggan hung in there, and Six gave him a hell of a match, you know, and I like the way, you know, I like the way it ends. I like the, you know, the gang mentality thing that happens. It gets over the fact that the NWO is always going to have the numbers advantage. It takes out a beloved legend in the wrestling game. So I think for me, this part was an A plus.
After that, fake Sting comes out, who they call NWO Sting now. He's no longer just fake Sting. And he will face Bob Ladeau. NWO Sting destroys this jobber and wins with an NWO Scorpion Deathlock as Hogan applauds this match. Wes, how'd you feel about this one?
Fake Sting looked pretty good in this match. He looked pretty dominant. I will say, Bischoff is talking crap as the bogus Sting is walking down to the ring.
That's true.
About like, oh, that's not the real Sting. Only an idiot wouldn't see that, and this and that. And their guys literally, when the fake Sting, bogus Sting came out, were acting like it was a carbon copy. Like
Yeah.
looking in the mirror, you can't figure out which Sting is which Sting. So I thought that was funny because for a second there, if you squint your eyes and you look, and you know you're not looking directly at it, I could see how he would look a little bit like Sting, you know, like Surfer Sting, especially 1996 black hair Sting. Like there's a smidge of a resemblance there. I understood the bogus Sting, but I felt like once, you know, it was revealed that it wasn't him, like that character should have gone away. It's crazy to believe that that character was over in Japan as big as he was. Like he wrestled as imposter as NWO Sting until like 1999, I believe, in Japan, and I always think that's so crazy.
We head to commercial and come back to High Voltage coming to the ring as they will face the amazing French Canadians. They sing "Oh Canada," which they've been doing for weeks, when the outsiders come down to the ring. Giant calls them the often imitated but never duplicated Hall and Nash in a really phenomenal line from Giant. I don't know if he planned that, knowing what's going on in WWF, but it is a great, great line from him. The outsiders take over for the French Canadians and they decide to face High Voltage. What ends up happening is the outsiders completely manhandle High Voltage and get the win. How did you feel about this one?
By the way, yeah, great line by the Giant. The match was too long, dude. It was a little bit too long. To touch on something really quick about that line that the Giant did deliver, I mean they had to have known that. Well, JR had already been teasing Razor and Diesel. I believe that Scott Hall went on record saying that they actually got pay raises after this because
Yeah.
backstage in WCW, they were like, "Hey man, just be honest with us. Are you guys jumping back? Are you jumping back? Don't jump back. Here, we'll give you more money." And of course, I mean, someone's putting money in your hand. Why would you say you're just gonna, you know, steer into the skin and say, "Yeah, sure, I'll stay," even though they were staying anyway. So I always thought that was a little funny. The match itself, I get it, man. I felt like that match could have been 5 minutes shorter easily, and it still would have gotten the point across. Hogan does have a great line during the match, though, because obviously they're talking about Halloween Havoc is going to be at MGM, and so he starts talking about Vegas, and he actually calls out Mike Tyson during this match while he's, you know, on the announce desk, and I just think that wow, how crazy would it have been had WCW gotten to Mike Tyson before WWE, how would that have impacted, the Monday Night Wars?
Mhm.
So I just think that's a super like interesting little nugget of,
I
during a match.
I could be wrong in this, but I feel like Bischoff has mentioned in the past they tried, and that one of the big things is when WWF got Mike Tyson, Kevin Nash was like, "Oh, we're fucked," like that, because people kind of like Mike Tyson's kind of a joke these days, but people don't realize like this dude in the '90s, like he was a god, like
Exactly.
he was that big.
Mike Tyson in the 90s is what Ronda Rousey was in 2018-19 when
Yeah,
WWE signed her. They were like he was the undisputed king of pay-per-view.
yeah,
So,
absolutely. So that's pretty much how this episode ends. With the idea of this is that obviously the NWO has completely taken over, especially without the WCW guys there. They did, the whole last hour of this show was emphasizing that. And that's the end of WCW, but that's not the end of our night. We move on to Raw. Raw is also September 23rd, 1996. They're at the Hershey Park Arena in Hershey Park, Pennsylvania. So it's a clever name. First, we get a recap of Mind Games, but if you want to hear about that, you'll have to subscribe to our Patreon, only $2 a month. Then it's the finals of the Intercontinental Tournament, which weirdly enough was not at Mind Games. Mr. Perfect joins on commentary, which makes a lot of sense as a major Intercontinental Championship holder in the past. Pat Patterson is a special guest referee, obviously the inaugural Intercontinental Champion holder. The match is Farouk versus Mark Marrow in the finals. The two start fighting almost immediately. Sable is with Marrow and Sonny is with Farouk, which is important to note because that will change next week. Marrow nails Farouk with Sonny's purse after a bunch of shenanigans, then hits the shooting star press, aka the Wild Thing, and he gets the 1-2-3. What'd you think of this, Wes?
I have it written down here in my notes that it's a really hot start. Marrow looks like a complete star at this time, and if you are just watching this without the benefit of hindsight, right, and knowing what's going to happen in the future, you would think that, hey, this guy's poised to probably be a star, man, because he comes out and he looks like $1,000,000. His moveset is very, fast paced, very active, a lot of flippy shit in there. It's crazy to think that, at one point Vince, this is, I believe, like there's a lot of conflicting reports, but a
Right.
lot of people say that he got the first guaranteed contract in pro wrestling, right? Especially during that time, guaranteed money. I think he might have been worth it back then. I actually had a Mark Marrow action figure around this time when I was young. I kind of dug the Wild Thing gimmick and the Wild Man gimmick back in the day. The match seemed almost a little too big for Raw at the time. I feel like Raw wasn't a big enough of a stage for it to host the finals of an Intercontinental
Right.
Championship. But it was a fun match. I would say the worst part of the match was Pat Patterson as referee. Super slow counts on various occasions during the match. But overall, it was definitely a solid showing by Marrow. Farouk even looks good at various points during the match. There's a Samoan drop spot from the second
Yes.
rope that
Yes.
was pretty gnarly. So overall, man, I really enjoyed it. I enjoyed the whole thing.
Ahmed Johnson at some point is on the phone during this match. He says he feels a lot better and he'll be back before you know it. He wished Marrow good luck during this, but he does say it's a cold day in hell when he returns. And then Lawler makes a joke at Jake the Snake because he's a piece
Oh
of
yes, I was gonna just reference that, dude. It was a
shit.
great joke.
He says that Ahmed Johnson got a kidney transplant from Jake the Snake, and Ahmed just goes, "Do you think that's funny?" Me too, Ahmed. Me too. Minus the big elephant in the room that'll happen later on in the night. I was like, "Oh, we'll get a pretty fun Raw." We won't. It's it's gonna fall
No,
pretty flat after this.
yeah, it fall. I mean, I was actually pretty excited when it started. And I'm like, oh, all right, cool. Raw's gonna,
Yeah,
counter with a really good show. They do not.
yeah.
It falls off the cliff after this.
One more decent thing is JR does interview Marrow. Marrow gives all glory and honor to Jesus Christ, and he thanks the fans and especially the most important person in his life, Sable. The crowd is completely hot for this, which emphasizes the point you made earlier about Marrow. Then Marrow gives a special thank you to Mr. Perfect for the wisdom he has provided. Now, this doesn't sound like a lot at this point, but this Mr. Perfect line will actually pay huge dividends many months down the line. We're not there yet, but trust us, fair listener, it will get there. We move on to our next segment where Razor and Diesel have a shared locker room. We get some IC title history of in 1995 when the roadie accidentally screwed Jeff Jarrett and HBK won the IC title for the third time. Then we find out that we are going to expose Double J as a fraud for his song With My Baby Tonight. Boy, that sounds fun, huh, Wes?
Dude, watching this, I was sitting there thinking like, why are we burying Jarrett so hard? And it took me a second to remember that, like, oh yeah, he just walked out the door in WWE. So in classic Vince fashion, because Vince McMahon is, if there was a Mount Rushmore of like petty, like celebrities or like people in the spotlight, Vince McMahon's got to be on there, right? Like he is probably the pettiest individual to ever be in that high position of power like that. And so it all made total sense after that. I'm sure that was the intention anyways, to always expose Double J, but I know that Vince leaned into it a lot more once Double J walked out the door. And knowing that, it kind of puts a little bit of a damper on it for me, because I feel like, oh, is this really how it was supposed to go, or is this a burial job? And I'd like to think it's somewhere in between. But it's a fun angle, right? The whole Double J. I mean, it's topical almost, even, right, with the whole Milli Vanilli thing in the '90s.
Which they do reference.
Yeah, Vince even references it. And another thing that I thought was cool about that is, it's very, at the time it wasn't rare, but it's cool to look back now and see Vince not on Raw, not on the show at all, but just doing the voiceover for a video package. I think that was pretty fun.
We come back. Doc Hendricks is back as the roster celebrates Mero's win. Then we hit the special report from Vince that we kind of just talked about, but it's really like a two-parter. They just mentioned it, then they bring it back and mention it, which is, I think, a waste of TV time. And it has no reveal because he goes, the song is actually written and sung by. We'll find out next week. So sorry, listener, if you want to know who that was, we'll talk about it next week. We move on and we have Owen Hart and the British Bulldog versus the Body Donnas. Clarence Mason is now the manager of Owen and Bulldog. He took advantage of Cornette when Cornette was hurt the previous night, and it's a whole bunch of weird stuff, and he's now the manager for some reason. One of the really interesting spots of this night, we get an invasion of Taz and Bill Alfonso, who are escorted away. This is the second ECW invasion, but to hear the first, you'll have to subscribe to our Patreon to listen to our In Your House Mind Games episode. Cornette is picture-in-picture, and he's mad because he thought he was signing a document to have Jose Lothario sued, but he was hoodwinked by Clarence Mason. Owen wins with a wheel kick and then hits the sharpshooter. That kind of wraps up this. Wes, what are your thoughts on this one?
That was pretty interesting. Owen and Bulldog are one of my favorite. They're probably my second favorite super team in wrestling history. I'd personally go with RVD and Kane as my top spot.
Nice.
Yeah, so I love Owen and Bulldog. I'm obviously a Heart Foundation mark. This is peak Davey and peak Owen to me. Clarence Mason's fun. I think, like, in hindsight, I think they could have done a little bit more with him. I actually had, referencing back to earlier, I had a Clarence Mason action figure, believe it or not. It came as in a 2-pack, Jack specific 2-pack, Clarence Mason and Crush. And so Clarence Mason is just one of those that's always going to be, near and dear to me, just because I had his action figure back in the day. So at the end of the match, Clarence Mason is on commentary, right? And he starts to tell a story of the strangest case of all time, because he's talking about, obviously he's a lawyer, he's a real life lawyer and stuff. And he starts talking about the craziest, strangest case of all time. And just as he's about to start divulging what happens, Owen Hart gets the tap out win using the sharpshooter, and it gets cut off and he jumps into the ring. And so now I'm super curious. I wonder if if it was designed that way, or if Owen just cut off the story. But overall, it was a fun match. It was entertaining. Didn't drag on too long, and it kind of just hit all the spots that you'd expect it to hit.
If we ever have Clarence Mason on the show, I'll make sure to ask him that question for you.
Exactly, that'd be cool.
Up next, we have in Your House Mind Games recap of Mankind and HBK. But like I said before, if you want to hear about that, you'll have to subscribe to the Patreon, $2 a month. We get a teaser for The Undertaker and Mankind at their Buried Alive match at WWF In Your House Buried Alive. Taker is in a graveyard with a shovel and says the wounds he suffered at SummerSlam have just begun to heal, but there is one scar that he will carry for eternity. This is the scar of betrayal. He tells Paul Bearer and Mankind that they witnessed who was truly the master of mind games last night. But if you want to witness that, you'll have to subscribe to our Patreon, $2 a month. Taker has condemned them to eternal damnation. He tells Mankind that he's going to bury him alive and that he will never rest in peace. Wes, what'd you think about this?
Strong Taker promo. I always think Taker's underrated for his like dead man promos
Yeah.
because even without Paul Bear at this time, they're right on the money, man. They're not like overly goofy. They don't get too wordy or anything, and they all kind of fit him. I will say though, I hate this era of Undertaker because of the fucking makeup. I don't like the extra mole they added.
Yeah.
I don't like the lines above the eyebrows to emphasize them a little more. Like I personally don't like that. I think that like a pale face, long hair covered Undertaker is more than enough to get the point across. But I also understand that in '96 he was kind of trying some stuff, so I'll give him a pass for that.
He's kind of in a transition phase. Yeah. He's going to go through a few things before you kind of get to like late 97 where he kind of looks really cool again, but it takes a while to get there.
Exactly. This is awkward. His ugly duckling phase as
There
he's
you go.
transitioning out of the purple gloves and stuff.
Up next, we have Doc Hendricks, who tries to interview Diesel and Razor. Razor slams a door in his face. We can't see either man's face, but that's kind of the whole segment for that. Sony's PlayStation, featuring the hit game Crash Bandicoot, presents the PlayStation Slam of the Week. It happened at Mind Games, so if you want to hear that, you'll have to subscribe to our Patreon, $2 a month. We get a video package about Vader and Cornette versus HBK and Jose Lothario next Monday. I can't wait, Wes. Can you?
Oh man, I'm glad I'm not here for that one. I'll be here in spirit, but that one's rough, right? When you're counting on Cornette and Lothario to kind of like anchor your show,
Yeah.
that's a little rough, dude.
Up next, Stone Cold joins on commentary. Kevin Kelly tries talking to him, but he tells him to shut up. Stone Cold says he can't use this word because of censors, but he says he'll use a word that rhymes with it. He spits on the life, career, and family of Bret the Hitman Hart. Fantastic line from Stone Cold.
Yeah, because that's really savage right there. Because he could have just been like, I spit on the life and career, but he had to make sure he added family in there, and I love that he did that.
Yeah.
96 Austin is a whole different breed, man. They don't make them like that no more.
He says if his parents had been smart enough to practice safe sex some 30 odd years ago, he wouldn't have to deal with Bret Hart right now. My God, he is crushing it. We go into our match, and it's Hunter Hearst Helmsley versus the Stalker. Mr. Perfect comes out to distract Helmsley by stealing his gal. Again, this leads to Stalker hitting the superplex for the win. I do want to mention real quickly, this is obviously still Helmsley in the doghouse. This will continue for a few weeks to months. And that's huge for the Helmsley character because Stalker had no business winning this, but he did. Wes, what are your thoughts on this one?
This one hurt, man, because I mean, I'm not a big Barry Windham guy, but it's kind of sad to see him in WWE at any point in his career, like except for like in the 80s with the US Express, like he was still like wet behind the ears and there was still a lot of his career in front of him. But watching Barry Windham in the 90s in WWE is just it was sad almost, dude. And this is just one of those examples, like he's out of shape. There's no definition in the arms. He's got the weird face paint on. I never dug mustache Wyndham anyways. The talent's there, right? You can see the in-ring talent. Like he's a natural. You can see why so many people thought he was going to be a building block for the NWA for years. But it was just, the character's not there. Like, I wrote it down right here. He looks like a time traveler Dudley Boy. Like that's the outfit he's wearing.
Yeah.
I could see Bubba wearing the exact same thing in 2000. The match itself was okay. Superplex off the top rope. That's a out of place finish nowadays, but in the 90s it was still acceptable.
Superplex was devastating in the 90s. It's not anymore.
Yeah, so I definitely the superplex was executed very nicely. Triple H sold it very very well. I feel bad for Barry Windham at this point because his career was supposed to go a lot different.
I do have two notes on this. Austin is low key great on commentary. He will do this every once in a while for the rest of this year, and he's great every single time he's on there. One of the interesting things is we've been referring to the Stalker as Barry Windham. They are not saying this. They are just calling him the Stalker. It's a horrible gimmick. However, Austin doesn't give a shit about this because he just straight up calls the Stalker Barry Windham and says we all know who he is. And I laughed so hard because to the point you made earlier, Windham deserves so much better and Stone Cold knows it, which I was very appreciative of. Moving on, we have JR announce that he will bring out Razor Ramon and Diesel, and the crowd, thinking this is who they are getting, explodes. But first, Paul Bearer and Mankind are also in a graveyard, the same graveyard. Bearer blames Taker for Mankind's loss at Mind Games. Technically, this isn't true, but if you want to hear about that, you'll have to subscribe to our Patreon, $2 a month. Mankind says that Taker's mistake was taking his destiny and making it personal. He says that Taker took something that was his, so now he'll take something of Taker's, his last breath. Then we cut back to JR, but before we do, Wes, what did you think of Bear and Mankind's promo?
I'll tell you after the commercial break that interrupts JR. I thought that was so funny because JR immediately, like, the match is over with Wyndham and Helmsley. Helmsley's not even out of the ring yet, and JR's like jumping in the ring.
Yeah.
Because he's so hyped to make this announcement. And then they cut to a promo, and then they cut to commercial when he comes back, and he's just so mad. So those people that are listeners of the Grilling JR podcast with him and Conrad, Conrad has a saying. He says, we all love red ass JR, right? When he's mad. And he was so pissed during this because they just keep cutting him off, and it was awesome, and I loved it. As far as the Mankind promo goes, though, man, I love Mankind. Mick Foley is so underrated as far as his promos. I think like the influx of his, like, when his voice goes up and down, and like the way the raspiness to it sometimes, and like 96 Mankind was so underrated. Like the intricacies that he included in his character, man, they took him over the top. The pulling out of the hair, the rocking back and forth. I love that his entrance music is always playing in the back of his promos, because it gives it like this eerie feeling. I love 96 Mankind, man. I think it's one of the most underrated, like, monster heel characters in wrestling history.
I'm not going to go too much in it because I don't think I could say anything on top of what you said. I think you pretty much handled that pretty well, and I don't think I could add anything to bring importance to that. However, we do go.
You can. I did miss one thing.
Well, you're about to add it. Go for it.
All right. If you want to listen to anything regarding Mind Games, their Patreon's only $2 a month. So make sure you sign up.
Appreciate the plug. After, like you said, we go to a commercial immediately, and then we come back, and finally, JR gets to say what he's been wanting to say all night long. JR has the mic, and he says he has no loyalty to WWF, just good old JR. In 1993, he left a great job in Atlanta, Georgia, from the Falcons to the WWF to be the primary play-by-play man, and that he is the best play-by-play man in the business. He shows up for work on the first day at WrestleMania 9, and they give him a toga. It's crap. And then he goes to the first King of the Ring, which he carried, and then he got bumped from play-by-play by the egotistical owner of the WWF, Vin Man, who couldn't stand the competition. And then on Super Bowl Sunday, he woke up with Bell's palsy. And he says that Vin Man called him into his office and fired him. He had to try to figure out how to tell his wife and 2 little girls that he got fired. Then Vin Man got indicted in the steroid trial later that year, so they called him back. When Vin Man was acquitted, he fired him again, and then hired him back for 50 cents on the dollar. He said it's no secret why all these guys are leaving the WWF, but he is bringing back the bad guy, Razor Ramon, who gets an ovation until the crowd realizes that this is We Have Razor Ramon at Home. Savio Vega attacks fake Razor as the show closes. This is a lot to go into. Wes, how'd you feel about all this?
JR's promo.
Yeah.
Jesus, right? Like, this is, during 2001 Invasion Angle, there's like that classic Heyman promo where he rips into Vince and says, you built this company off of Hogan's, sweat and Brett's sweat and tears and Shawn Michaels and all this and that. And who you stole from the most, you stole from me and this and that, right? This is a precursor to that, man. This is, like 5 years prior to that promo, JR goes in. And a lot of times, a lot of people credit Stone Cold or like Brett, right, for pulling the curtain back in 97 and outing Vince as the owner. But this is a year before that, and JR's doing it here. So I love the promo. 10 out of 10 promo for me. Probably the best promo of Jim Ross's career. Close second is the one where he kicks Michael Cole in the balls after he comes back and does heel JR. But I loved it, man. I loved it. And yeah, you know what? So I think the crowd was always a little suspicious that something was up, because you would think that when that tire screech hit and, the drums start to hit, Razor's music hits, that the pop would have been bigger. And it really wasn't.
Right.
The pop gets bigger when the silhouette starts coming, starts making its way out of the back, and you're like, oh shit, it is Razor. And then it's not. And then you can see So there's an audible pop and then an audible deflation of the
Yeah.
audience when they realize it's not Razor. And I mean, that's pretty much, that sums up this entire episode of Raw, because it was just like, okay, I'm waiting for something, and then you get it and you're like, oh, it's this
Yeah.
version of it. Okay,
This
well.
is what we get. Yeah.
Okay, well, now you don't even need to bring out Diesel, because now I don't even care. And then the way the show cuts off, I understand it to a degree, like kind of leave it in suspense, but also like it was a little sudden,
Yeah.
and it kind of left me feeling unfulfilled a little bit.
So I wasn't able to find anything on this, but going into armchair Booker here, which I would never have done this, but my theory is the plan was to have Diesel show up too, because you obviously have him in the back. They're teasing him, right? And they keep mentioning, they mentioned for weeks that they were both going to be here tonight. I think what was going to happen was that Savio Vega was going to attack Razor Ramon, and then Diesel was going to come in for the save, cementing them, blah, blah, blah. But they ran out of time, so they just cut it abruptly. Because you're right, it like Savio Vega attacks, and then we're just done. There's no resolution to that conflict, and we don't get to see for another week anything out of that, which is unfortunate. I will talk about the JR promo. It is, like you said, it's a fantastic promo, probably the best of his career. It's phenomenal, and I strongly, if you're going to watch anything from this Raw, watch this promo, then cut off the minute he says he's bringing in Razor Ramon. You don't need to see that. But the promo is great. The one bad thing I'll say about this promo is that this is supposed to turn JR heel. And you can't help but listen to this promo and be like, yeah, you got fucked, dude. Like, absolutely, yeah, exactly. You're right. Like, you have every reason to be mad. And so for the next few weeks that they'll try to make JR heel, which it really will only last a few weeks, every time that the commentary is like, oh, you're not being right. And so it's like, no, dude, he's got a point. And it's hard as a fan to hear that and be like, I should root for Vince in this situation, especially with what we know nowadays. But even in 1996, it's difficult to see that and be like, why the hell would I root for this guy?
Exactly. That's the kind of the sense I got out of it too. I mean, if you listen to JR and anytime he talks about Vince was kind of determined to bury him since the beginning. Like, he hated that. I feel like Vince hated that JR was so good, and that everybody acknowledged how good he was, and that had he ever just decided randomly like, well, I'm going to end JR's career or anything like that, like, it wouldn't have really happened. And I think that kind of irks Vince, because Vince liked to have he liked to feel like he had your career in the palm of his hand. That's how he got his power, right? And the fact is that was never really true with JR, because he tried to end JR multiple times, and JR always kept coming back, and Vince always ended up wanting him / needing him back. By the way, I think it was a beautiful touch to have it be Savio Vega who they target, and Savio Vega who attacks Fake Razor, because in the storyline, obviously, Savio Vega's introduced into the WWE Universe by Razor Ramon, the original Razor Ramon, Scott Hall. So I thought that was a nice touch. Man, I'm being as nice as I can, because that was a horrible way to end the show. I thought it fell flat. To go from JR's promo and then immediately drop so far back down, like it's not really ideal. But hey, man, it's 1996 WWE for you.
I don't remember what it is, but Scott has a theory as to how you make the fake Razor and fake Diesel work, and I'm sure listeners over the next few weeks he will be more than happy to regale you in it, because I told him straight up there's no way it'll ever work. And then he told me something that I went, all right, that you might have a point on that. That being said, that is the end of Raw, which means it's also the end of our show. Obviously, we didn't have Scott today, but we had the next best thing you could have in Wes. Wes, thank you so much for joining me. I hope you had a good time. We hope to have you back for sure. You can go ahead and catch his Instagram, which is Flashback Wrestling, and also Sportster, where he writes articles. Wes, thank you, man. Appreciate you. You have anything else you want to say before we head out?
No, man. Thank you for having me on. It was a blast. I'd been out of the podcast game for since I had my daughter, so it's about 5 years now since I recorded a podcast. This was great, man. It was like getting back on a bike. I would love to join you guys again in the future. Maybe get to talk to Scott a little bit. But yeah, it was fun, man. Thank you for having me on.
All right. That's it for us. Bye, guys. Hey, everybody. It's Joseph. And guess what? Not only can you listen to us every Monday on Spotify, but you can find us on Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, Amazon Music, and YouTube Podcasts as well. Just search for Monday Night Wars Podcast. If you want to reach out to us, you can find us on Twitter at MON Night Wars Pod, on Instagram at Monday Night Wars Podcast, or just email us at mnwpodcast@gmail.com. And finally, subscribe to our Patreon at Monday Night Wars Podcast. For $2 a month, you get every pay-per-view from WCW and WWF during this era, as well as additional content later on. Once again, thank you for listening. We'll see you here next time on the Monday Night Wars Podcast.